Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2020 McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society, a program of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, part of the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Mike Butterworth. I am the director of the center, and it's my privilege to welcome you all today and to introduce our program. The Center for Sports Communication and Media is dedicated to the study, instruction, and practice of sports journalism, broadcasting, media production, advertising, public relations, and the human dynamics within sports, including interpersonal relationships on teams, organizational communication, and the use of sports as a platform for advocacy. Our programming aims to connect students with each other, alumni, and industry professionals, and that's exactly our goal today. Now, we're going to meet our outstanding panel in just a moment, but first I need to offer some thanks, starting with the leadership in the Moody College of Communication, including our Dean, Jay Bernhardt, and everybody who helps with our marketing and promotional efforts. A second to our tech team, who have played an essential role and on whose work we lean on all the more heavily in this world of virtual programming. Third, I want to thank our moderator and panelists, whose talent and energy will surely make this a memorable conversation. I cannot wait to hear from them in a moment. Fourth, to all of you who have registered and have joined us today, we're grateful to have your support, and we encourage you to participate throughout the discussion, and you can do that in a couple of ways. First, after this introduction, I'm going to disappear, but I'll be monitoring the chat window. And if you have questions during the panelists' conversation, please post those questions in the chat window, and we'll try to get those toward the end of the discussion. You can also participate by following us on Twitter and live tweeting your comments and questions along the way. We are at UT_CSCM. And today we're using the hashtags McGarr 2020, Sports Radio, and Podcast Life. So please join us there as well. Finally, let me thank Cappy McGarr, for whom this symposium is named. Cappy has 2 degrees from the University of Texas at Austin, and he is an avid supporter of the university, the Moody College of Communication, and the Center for Sports Communication and Media. In fact, it was his gift years ago that allowed UT to launch its first course in sports journalism. And that legacy has much to do with what we're able to do right here today. So it is my pleasure to now introduce you to Cappy McGarr. Cappy, thank you so much for being a wonderful friend of the program, and it is all yours.
Thank you, Mike. I'm a proud alumnus and supporter of the Moody College of Communication and University of Texas at Austin. Let me begin by thanking those who helped put this event together, and particularly you, Mike. Mike Butterworth has done an outstanding job for the center, and of course, our fearless leader, Dean Jay Bernhardt. Thank you both. And of course, we've got an outstanding panelist and audience. Thank you for tuning in. The McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society debuted in 2006 as a product of my interest in sports journalism. Over the years, we've hosted programs about race, performance-enhancing drugs, head injuries, and more. We've had every sports greats from everybody from Jim Brown to Greg LeMond and many, many others. It's our belief that sports are never just about sports, something that has become all more obvious during a year in which we've seen a resurgence of athletic activism and the effect of athletes and leagues because of an unprecedented public health crisis. Indeed, the McGarr Symposium, like other events sponsored by the Center for Sports Communication and Media, has been affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Yet despite our circumstances, we have a unique opportunity to present today's program, which brings together leading voices in sports radio and podcasting from around the country. The industry has faced a profound change over the years, yet sports talk remains robust format on radio. Meanwhile, reasonable estimates suggest anywhere between 1 and 1.5 million podcasts are currently available, many of which feature sports. Between traditional forms and new innovation, it's safe to say that many of the most pressing issues in sports media can be understood by taking a closer look at this arena. Our conversation today will cover a range of issues, including a discussion of changes to radio station formats, networks, and conglomeration, the emergence of growth of podcasting and the relationship developed between host and audience, and questions of identity, culture, and representation. As I've noted, we've assembled an all-star lineup. Here to lead off and introduce our panelist is Eric Ferguson. Eric is one of the most recognized voices in Chicago, where he has consistently led the morning drive time ratings as a host of 101.9 FM, The Mix. He's a friend of the Center for Sports Communication and Media and the Moody College of Communication, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and Eric, it's all yours.
Cappy, thanks. Very excited to be here. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Butterworth, for asking me to be involved. I'm a huge fan of sports in general and of the panelists that we have here. They're among the best in the country. It is going to be a real treat to not only have the chance to moderate this, but to sit back and listen to their unique perspectives that they're going to add to all this. So I'm very excited to be a part of it. My son is a sophomore at the University of Texas. I can't think of any place I'd rather be involved with. So that being said, I don't want to delay any of this. Let's get right to it and meet our panelists. When I call your name, go ahead and click on. I want to share a little bit about each of you. First up is Raheel Ramzanali. He's worked in Houston media since 2007, hosting radio shows 1560 The Game and ESPN Houston. Currently, he is a sports contributor at ABC 13, where he hosts the No Layups podcast. He's also a sports anchor at NTV Houston. And in addition to radio and TV, Ramzanali has also worked as the stadium reporter for the Houston Roughnecks in the XFL. He is a graduate with high honors from the School of Journalism at UT Austin's Moody College of Communication. Raheel, Hookem, nice to see you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. And your son's going places because he's at the greatest university on this planet.
That's exciting. Thank you for being here. Next up is Sarah Spain. She's an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning radio host, TV personality, and writer. Is the host of Spain and Fitz, airing weeknights on national ESPN radio, host of ESPN's That's What She Said podcast, and a writer for ESPNW.com. She is a regular panelist on Around the Horn and Highly Questionable, and also a Sports Center reporter. We see her all the time. She won the 2019 Dan Jenkins Medal for Excellence in Sports Writing for her ESPN The Magazine article, Runs in the Family, and she is a graduate of Cornell. Sarah, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Good to be here.
Thanks for being here. Tamryn Spruill hosts the Hard Screen podcast and works as a freelance journalist and author covering women's basketball with issues of gender, race, and sexuality central to her reporting. She has followed the WNBA since its inception in 1996 and is writing a book published by Abrams Books about its exciting history. Spruill's bylines include The Athletic, The New York Times, Zora, Teen Vogue, Bleacher Report, and Swish Hoops. That's a lot. Where she also has served as editor-in-chief since 2018, when hired as the first woman to hold that position. Spruill has a BA from the University of South Carolina and a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from Goddard College. Tamryn, are you there? There she is.
There we go.
Hi. Welcome.
I just got to unmute you.
Jeff Ward is the host
right.
of the Jeff Ward Show for the Statesman News Network, a streaming service produced by the Austin American-Statesman newspaper and hosted by their corporate parent, Gannett Media USA Today. Ward hosted a top-rated afternoon drive-time radio show on AM 590 KLBJ in Austin for over 20 years, being named the best afternoon show host 5 times by the Austin Chronicle. Ward is a graduate of UT Austin, where he was a 4-time football letterman and a 2-time All-American place kicker, and has been a lecturer in the Moody College's Stan Richards School of Advertising and Public Relations. Jeff, are you there?
I am. Great to be back on campus, sort of.
We've got your audio, but no video yet, so we'll have to click over to that. Hopefully that'll come through. And then finally, my good friend David Kaplan is a radio personality who hosts Cap and J Hood on ESPN 1000 in Chicago, in addition to co-hosting Sports Talk Live, a daily sports roundtable discussion show on NBC Sports Chicago. Cap has worked in Chicagoland media for some 30 years. He doesn't look it. Hosting several noted drive time radio shows, as well as pre and post game broadcasts for the Chicago Cubs. After a 21-year career at WGN Radio, Cap has signed a multi-year deal with ESPN in 2015, where he works with Jonathan Hood on the morning sports talk show. He's a graduate of Hamline University, where he received a BA in English and is a great dresser. Cap, how are you?
Great to be here. Honored to be on this esteemed panel, and great to be with you, my friend.
Good to see all of you. Thank you all for being here. I suppose let's just dive right into it. The current state of sports radio and the sports radio format, with the internet and streaming and podcasting all affecting the way that the listener consumes your information. How has sports radio and its format been impacted and evolving during these times? with all of these different influences. Why don't we start with you, Jeff? You can jump off there and we can get the discussion going.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think everyone would agree there's the content portion of what we do. And I think we have to probably talk about the two tracks here because obviously the medium where we are has changed dramatically. But the content portion, I would submit hasn't changed at all. What we do, how we approach it, what we talk about, I'm not quite sure that that's completely changed. And the rules are, I think, still the same. The fundamental principles are you know your stuff, you're fearless, you are compelling or entertaining, however you want to frame that. And then that, I think, has stayed the same for the most part. What's not the same, of course, is the medium and the platform. And in that regard, we have to adapt because the idea that, and I think all of us can appreciate this over time, the idea of having the audience trapped in their car during drive time where they have maybe 40 options, those days are not completely gone, but I think we all realize they're shrinking pretty quickly. So now we live in a world where there's not just the 40 options in the car, which is nice to have them and have them trapped there. I like to tell my audience, or used to tell my audience, traffic is my friend. So they now have, what did I hear early on, 1 million options, maybe 4,000 options, whatever that number is. So the content of what we do remains the same. Being unaware of the medium that we're on is a mistake because I think what we have to do now, and I find myself falling into old school radio mode quite often, and that is the medium needs to be packaged the same way, except we need to put them in 8 and 10 minute increments. So one of the things that I found that I've done over time is, while you might have a 3-hour show, the truth of the matter is the audience is looking for 20 shows at 8 minutes a pop, that kind of format. So we have to be aware, same content provider, same fearless content provider, but be aware of how the audience is listening and learn to reinvent ourselves to package them in segments that they can appreciate and they can download and they can live via podcast, because that's the way it's going to be going forward.
Excellent. Now, you brought up the concept of 8 different shows or 20 different shows in 8 minutes at length. And in an environment where we live right now, where sports for the long period of time went dormant, have you guys found it more challenging from a content perspective? Have you changed the rules of the content? What you might have used a year ago, you're using different things now in order to engage the audience when there just isn't as much sports information to be talking about?
Well, I think for anyone, right?
Anyone.
Right?
Anyone.
Yeah, I'll speak. I think I'm the only person who does national here. What's interesting about that is at least there's a much broader range of topics already at your disposal to start with versus the more locally focused nature of a specific city's coverage. But that being said, it was still months of 3 hours every night without any actual sports. So there was a lot of conversation about how leagues and individual athletes were handling coronavirus and the expectation for when those leagues would return. But it was also simultaneous with the civil unrest in our country post George Floyd. And it felt absolutely at ESPN that there was a softening of rules about what constitutes sports talk radio. There's always still that sports tie that they're looking for, but with the understanding that there was literally no games to talk about and no competitions to get into, there was a lot more freedom to talk about the intersection of the social issues and sports of coronavirus plus civil unrest plus athletes that felt like they were being pulled to get to their communities instead of just their teams, or even the pull to potentially opt out of the bubble for the NBA or WNBA players or other sports because they didn't want to draw focus from conversations being had of bigger issues. So I felt like for that 6 months or so, boy, I never really felt like I was at a loss for words. That's never really been a problem. I think that's why I do this job. But it was, a lot more freedom to get creative. And then bang, everything came back. And I keep calling it the sports apocalypse. It felt like a good thing, but at times working in sports, it was incredibly overwhelming to try to actually know and watch NHL playoffs, MLB playoffs, WNBA playoffs, NBA playoffs, the start of college football, the start of NFL, everything at once, and then gauge what's the most important and what's the content you want to put into a short show, because now you have everything at once instead of nothing.
Was it challenging, stressful? Was it enjoyable, stressful for each of you during those times to try to put together a show, Cap?
So first of all, Sarah's exactly right. The rules changed. Like on my show, we don't talk politics. We talk sports. There's other places for people to go. But with no games and what happened with George Floyd and what happened and went on in the city of Chicago, and in many cases, right outside the doors of our office building, we had to be there for people that wanted an opportunity to talk, many times in an emotional state. And I remember an entire week after George Floyd, that's basically all we talked about. And our bosses were great. If that's what people want to talk about, we have to be there for them. But I also remember saying to my two producers back in March, I think it was like March 15th, okay, this is going to be the greatest challenge of our career, because when Mitchell Trubisky throws 4 interceptions, it's basically give out the phone number and phew, you got 3 hours of calls. It's stealing. When there's no games and there's nothing going on, you better be more creative than you've ever been. And I feel like we're better today having gone through it. I just wouldn't want to go through it again like everybody else would.
Yes, Tamryn.
Yeah, I guess a little different perspective is covering the WNBA with the season over the summer. Thankfully, we had games to go with everything else. The abrupt end to the NCAA season was dizzying. You know, I was about to travel to the SEC tournament to cover it, the women's tournament, and got sick. I had COVID and I was sick for a month, and then there was no sports that came back. So that disrupted a lot. But when everything came back, we learned that there was going to be a WNBA season, covering how that would happen. And in the WNBA, issues of gender and race and equity are always kind of intermingled. So at Swish Appeal, we have not really had to do much that's different. Like, we've already been covering those issues. They come up regularly in that space. And so with the hard screen, my coverage stayed the same.
And Raheel, I just want to give you an opportunity to respond here. Is this when you first got into this business and had visions and ideas of what it looked like, and all of those visions and ideas, I'm certain, changed back in March? How did it affect the way that you approached it and the way that you executed what you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. The content game changed so much, not because I wasn't generating content or Sarah wasn't, or Jeff, David, Tamryn. It's that so many other people are generating content. Your content standing out now with this big flood of content where everyone's creating. That was a big challenge. You know, before, when I first started, I had a huge interview with Chad Ochocinco. It went viral back in the viral days of 2008 when Twitter first started. And, you know, he said he was going to tweet during games, and it was the news for 2 days, right? Like, everyone's talking about it. Now, if you have an interview like that, you might get maybe 10 minutes on Twitter and, you know, people move on. So it's just so much harder for your content to stand out. And now when you add the fact that everyone's at home and more people are creating content, how do you stand out within that content game has been a huge challenge.
I love that you said that too, with so many people generating content, because it leads me to my next question, where with podcasting and satellite and so many different outlets for the audience to reach all of the, or consume all the different things that they're hoping to, from a sports medium, from a lifestyle perspective, all of those things. Many people say that radio is dying, that because of these different opportunities that are there for the listener and for the consumer, that radio is operating at a disadvantage. How would you assess the current state and health of your particular medium of sports radio? Why don't we throw that one to Tamryn to start? How would you assess the health of the medium right now?
Well, I could only speak to podcasts because I don't do radio. And I would just say that, kind of leaping off of what Raheel said, the market is flooded. There's just so much content. There's so much creativity, and there's a lot of great things. In terms of getting lost, this is my independent podcast that I do on my own, because I felt like there was a gap that needed to be filled with certain stories that I'm not seeing in other media forms. So, you know, but I'm an independent producer, independent podcast. I don't have a major company behind me. So getting out there, it's just kind of, you have to rely on social media. You have to rely on whatever connections you have. I'm a freelancer, so I write for other for various publications, and kind of leap on those stories to generate my podcast content. But as far as building an audience, even the WNBA audience, women's basketball is marginal compared to NBA or men's college basketball. So doing it for the women is, it's just kind of word of mouth and a tweet here and a tweet there and just a slow build. So I honestly don't have expectations to rise up to, be some podcasting giant in this space that's so flooded. But I do value the content I'm creating and the people who contribute to it. So I carry it forward.
The health of sports radio. Any of the rest of you, Jeff, how do you feel about it right now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to hear two things because I think there's two separate subjects. What is the health in terms of the business? That's a discussion all by itself. What's the health of radio as a medium? That's a discussion all by itself. In my experience, without offending anyone, is radio better be careful not to be Sears, because you better adapt, you better pivot as a medium. As content providers, which we're all in that space, and I think somebody said something that's pretty accurate. One thing about the lack of sports and maybe even COVID to a degree, it should have made us better at what we do. I like to say talent wins, and I think that's true of what we do. If you're good at what you do as a content provider, even though we live in a world where it's not 40 stations, it's 4 million podcasts, talent is going to win. Interesting is going to win. Compelling is going to win. I've always had a mission statement in spite of what my bosses would tell me. They would walk and tap on the door and say, why aren't we talking about X, Y, and Z? And my answer was, I'm a bar stool for a couple of 100,000 people. That's what I do. Do they want to come to this bar stool? Do they want to talk? Do they want to share opinions? Do they find it insightful and compelling and at times smarter? Then I'm going to do okay. That's one subject, which I think we've all been forced in a good way to be better at what we do because of the past 6 months to a year. The other side of it is not completely within our control, except we're all having to scramble and fight like everyone else. And that issue is, what's the medium doing to be, instead of, I hope they stop and listen to me, to forcing them to stop and listen to me? Those are two separate subjects, because the business itself, even with COVID, the business itself as a medium of radio is in a dangerous space.
Yeah, so two quick things on that. I'm not going to name any names, but do you remember the Super Bowl when the lights went out and we had a desk full of former players mostly, and they could not think of a thing to say? It was painful to watch. It was an unexpected interruption of a Super Bowl. It is a very stressful time. Millions of people are watching. I wouldn't begin to know how I would handle it, but I would like to think I would have something to say because that's my job. It was pulling teeth that day. And I do think, to Jeff's point, if you are talented, you can talk your way out of, you can describe a box for 5 minutes and make people find it interesting. So that's going to be the thing that separates the great from the just okay, no matter how flooded the market is. It is going to be more difficult the more people that are out there, but I think transparency, genuineness, and a genuine interest in what you're talking about is going to set you apart at this point when there are so many options. There used to be this thing, don't make yourself the story. It was more a journalism thing than it was for radio, which is very much about creating community and wanting people to hear from you specifically. But now more than ever, people have to say, not only do I want sports from Sarah. I'm going to go find out where Sarah's talking about sports. So I have to figure out what about me makes people want to choose me over the other options. And then for the medium, what's interesting is we say radio, and what we mean by radio is terrestrial radio, but that's essentially a podcast that's live that you listen to via a dial, but then it becomes a podcast if you load it as one. So the content doesn't necessarily have to change depending on how you view what your general listenership is. I host a show at night, and so if we're talking about games that are about to happen and we're setting people up for them, that's not going in the podcast because most people the next morning are not going to listen to us preview a game that already happened. We're going to select the pieces, put it into a podcast of the things that we still find interesting. That's an adjustment that you make now when you realize that a lot of people listening are going to digest it later all at once in podcast form. Dan Le Batard's show on ESPN National Radio is a perfect example of this. They're almost episodic. There are so many inside jokes and recurring bits and funny things that the people who listen to it don't want to miss a day. So instead of moving on to the next one, they're going to wait, listen to the podcast, and then catch up. And because of that, they're aware of not maybe playing by the same rules as the average terrestrial radio show because they're actually now focused more on building that podcast brand. So I think the lines are being really blurred between radio and podcast. A lot of times it's the same now.
That's a great point that, when I was at ESPN Houston, that's a conversation I would have with management so much, that it's not just sports radio anymore. People are consuming us on podcasts as much as sports radio right now. And you can just look at the downloads, you can look at the numbers. So from a medium perspective, you're all blended together now. And then from an individual perspective, and Sarah, I'd like to pay you a huge compliment here, just watching you, that you're not just a radio host anymore. You're writing, you have to do TV, you've got to do video, you've got to create unique content that's not just radio specific. So when I talk to younger students about that, I'm like, don't just focus on radio, because that's not going to be your job anymore, because your job is, can you produce content on various mediums, not just sports radio? So just want to throw that in there as well for sports radio as well.
Cap, let me ask you a question. On this topic, on this theme, much like Sarah, you're a jack of all trades. You do TV.
Hardest
you do
working
radio.
man in Chicago.
Yeah, you are the hardest working man in Chicago. You do TV, you do radio, you do podcasting, you do all of these different things. And when we talk about the health of sports radio, do you think it's important during your day to build synergy between all of them, or do they operate all independently as you're doing it?
I guess it depends on what the topic is. I feel like we have an advantage when we do local, especially in a city that Sarah knows so well, in Chicago. Even when we're not playing, if there was no games in the spring, we could start talking about Nick Foles, Mitchell Trubisky, the Cubs finances. There are certain hot button topics, the Bulls getting a new front office, that gave us unbelievable content, because you tap into the emotions of the fans who are either listening on a smart speaker at home, some that were still in their car. But in a local market versus national, like Sarah does all these different things, but she may tap into somebody talking about pick the New York team, but somebody in California might want to say, I want to hear about my team. Here, I just got Chicago teams. We don't talk, unless it's a massive story, we don't talk national stuff. It's all local. But man, you tap into that narrative of Mitchell Trubisky's a busted pick, or Gar and Pax did a lousy job with the Bulls, and you can carry yourself 3 hours like that.
Raheel, you said something that caught my attention. I believe it was you. You said you got to make sure you don't want them to miss a day, or maybe Sarah said, one of the two of you. How do each of you go about, from Tamryn, your podcasting, to your sports radio, to your TV work? How do you go about identifying each day things or topics or concepts that will cause the listener to not want to miss you? What about you what about what you do makes it unique and a destination for them?
I would say, first of all, is just that they don't see it. Like, I don't see this kind of stuff, anywhere else, kind of going really deep into a very compressed. I set a limit that the episodes are only 20 to 30 minutes, because we know people are not going to, they want to listen, as was stated, like in 8-minute increments and move on. And there are pauses so that people can pause it and come back later and what have you. But I very much leap off of whatever I'm writing. So I have something that's coming out, can't really say what it is yet, but with Natasha Cloud and Renee Montgomery. And so I'm doing a series of podcast episodes based on those interviews. And a lot of it surrounds the election, so it's timely. And there's only a certain amount of words, it's like, this has to be 900 words, what have you, for the publication. But the conversation usually is so much bigger in the interviews. And I know that the athletes I speak with, especially on social justice, want, their voices heard and more known of what they're doing. And those two opted out of the season. So that's going to come after the publication, hits the market. So that's pretty much what I leap off of, is just extending the conversation of what I've already written about and just taking it a step further in this kind of format.
All in agreement? Any others?
I think the community too, just if it's not going to be necessarily like Levitard, where it truly is, what is this splash joke that they keep saying? Or why do they keep playing this rejoin of something? I don't know what happened. I got to go back and find out what happened and why they keep playing this. That's really tough to pull off. And a lot of that is sort of the creation of a full cast of characters there that they can pull from and do these bits. I think for the rest of us, and speaking at least for me, I know that there are people who are going to miss a show that's 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern, right? People have lives and dinner and family. But what I want them to care about is the relationship between me and my co-host, Jason Fitz. And what is it about listening to us and continuing to hear us engage with each other and crack jokes at each other's expense? And wait, what is this thing that Jason Fitz keeps mannequins in his closet year round so that his Halloween display on his front lawn is killer every single year, so that if I'm mentioning the mannequins in Fitz's closet and you don't get the reference, you're like, I gotta figure out what I missed here, right? So it's that relationship between me and my co-host. And then with my podcast, it's absolutely just about giving people the chance to listen to somebody. They see a guest that they don't know or don't necessarily think they would care about, and make it so compelling that they start saying, no matter who the guest is, if Sarah found this person interesting and thought this was worth my time, I'm going to listen and realize, wow, Renee Montgomery, who I did just have on, is a badass, and I wish I knew more about her. Or this neuroscientist that Sarah just, because my podcast is anyone and every Saturday Night Live cast members, neuroscientists, musicians. If I find it interesting and I bring you enough of that good stuff every time, then you're going to give it a click and give it a shot, even if you don't know who the person is. So that's kind of the goal.
Let me throw something. Go ahead, John.
I would add something here at the risk of nerding out and being the advertising professor. I do think this is what applies and what we're all talking about. And that is, and don't want to wrap ego too much into this, but we're brands. It's as simple as that. Mm-hmm. You're a brand. And when your brand means something to the consumer, in our case, it's meaning something to the viewer, the listener, the reader, whatever it is, we have to matter as brands. And once somebody becomes dependent upon a brand, what's that brand going to give me? What is that brand saying? What is that brand acting like? How outrageous is it? I mean, whatever that brand means to me, that's when you're good at your job. You know, the world can be full of talk show hosts, but it's not full of very many brands. And the quest is to become a brand. And when you're a brand, whether it's 100,000 people in Austin or 3 million people around the country, what matters is, wonder what Jeff has to say about that. I wonder if Jeff's going to agree with me. I wonder if Jeff's going to disagree with me. I become dependent upon the brand.
Yeah. When people come to you and say, ooh, I can't wait to hear what Cap has to say, or, oh my God, Sarah's going to go off on this, that's when you realize, okay, right, people are starting to get who I am and they want to hear from me specifically about this thing.
But I also think Sarah has a big challenge being on a national stage and being able to cultivate that sense of community. Mm-hmm. You know, we're all Bears fans here. You're doing it on a national level. It's pretty damn impressive.
Thanks, Cap.
Let me throw this at you. You know, we've been talking about sports radio, the concept of terrestrial radio. We've been talking quite a bit about podcasting, and let's move into another element of what has become an element of broadcasting, and that being social media and its level of importance, not only as a resource, but as a promotional tool. Cap, I'm going to throw this one your way. How do you find and how do you personally use social media as a resource to complement and promote what you do?
Well, I use it at night usually to try and engage with people, hoping that when they get up in the morning, they're like, I want to hear more about that discussion, or to engage. I'm watching the Cubs game and I do something after every Cubs game. I'll do a video like 2 minutes long of my take on whether they won, lost, why they did what they did.
Tell them the name, Cap. It's a good name.
It's called The Recap with a K. So I will do those and I have a lot of fun with them, and I'll use social media that way. But again, in the mornings, we'll use it to hopefully drive people. Here's what we're going to do. We're having this topic with this guest. We're not a huge guest show. 3 hours, we had one guest today. We think guests a lot of times are guests for guests' sake. We would rather you tune in for our personality and our take rather than saying, oh, we're playing the Cincinnati Reds. Let's get the Reds beat writer on. Really? Is that really engaging radio? We can tell you about what's going on in the game. And then I try to also use social media, breaking stories, any type of news that comes along. The one problem that you have with social media is anybody can get a Twitter account. Anybody can go out and tweet something. And then my news director calls and says, there's this report that the Cubs are trading so-and-so. Well, you know it's not true, but you still have to do your homework because some jackaloon in his basement is out there tweeting trade rumors.
And that's a good point. You know, there are positives to social media and negatives to social media. And Twitter in particular, I know, is a lifeblood for what many of you do. For you, Raheel, first of all, do you think that social media is an important component in what you do? And if so, great. If not, what are the downsides to it?
Oh, it's a huge component. One, it helps you get a pulse on what people are talking about, right? You can look at what's trending. You can look at local stories. You can see what's getting the most reaction. And that helps a lot in determining that, hey, this audience might appreciate the story or bring it up. For me personally, look, there are a lot of downsides to Twitter, and I can't even imagine, like, and Sarah, you do share a lot of the hate that you get sometimes. I try, like, anytime I get any kind of hate, I mute or block the person. I move on. I don't even engage. To me, I use social media to build the brand that we've talked about, right? And leverage that brand not only for future opportunities, but for opportunities outside of sports radio. And the more you can build that community up and build that quote unquote brand, like, I feel dirty saying that, but the more you can do that, the more valuable you are to other companies as well. So I love it, and I treat it, I try to make it as positive as I can on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And if I get any negativity, I block it out. I don't want, because I'm on there to have fun, right? I want to escape for a little bit and engage with people that are doing the same thing, and they want to be cool about it.
Does the negativity?
So I usually, well, I was just going to say, I usually actually mute and block, I would say, anywhere between like 49 out of 50, or if it's not as bad of a day, 9 out of 10. Whenever people tell me don't feed the trolls, I say I want to present an example for other women online who maybe are getting the same thing and don't feel strong enough to respond and clap back, or who want to know that other people are getting this too so they don't feel alone. And also because I'm not going to digest BS all day and never get to respond. That then forces it on me to ingest it and take it. And every once in a while, I need to be able to have a proactive response. So I usually just take people with bad spelling or grammar who've already given me an easy in, or someone who just, if someone says something that's a repeated bad point of view or flawed premise, I'll pick one of them to use as an example, because there's a lot of people in the middle that are not responding or writing, but they're paying attention. And I have had them reach out to me and say, oh, I've never thought of it that way, whether that's something about misogyny or LGBTQ plus issues or whatever that gets spread online. I like to respond in a way that other people will kind of listen and get it. I think there's tons of negativity about social media, and I am deeply thankful that I was already a mostly formed human being by the time it came around with a sense of self, because I really feel for people coming up. I know how much more it affected me even in my early 20s in this industry versus now when I can just shrug it off. But it's huge for your brand, and especially for women. I remember when I started ESPN 1000, people asked who wrote my updates for me. Now, the update anchor job was a great one to get, but it's not a lot. It's every 15 minutes or half hour you come on and say what's going on. The fact that someone thought that I would have them written and then my only job would be to read the 1 minute was, it just showed that, or I went on, started going on TV shows on ESPN, is everything you say in the teleprompter. Nothing's in the teleprompter. It's coming from here. But people especially don't think that with women. So when you're on the world's biggest sports bar and you're reacting in the second to the game you're watching or to the person that tweets you, I think that gives people a reminder that I know my stuff and I'm witty and quick and it's not scripted. And that's really important for women in this business, because a lot of people still don't believe that we get it and that we're in on the jokes with them. And so I use it as an opportunity to show my personality and prove that.
Tamryn,
Yeah, one of the things I also did, I took a social media class and they said, unless somebody is really, really offsides, mute them rather than block them. If you block them, you let them know that they got to you. So I just go mute.
Yep.
And I've gotten to the point where I remember somebody said something pretty distasteful to me and I'm going back at them. And my wife was standing behind me. She goes, that person has 4 followers. What are you doing? You can't hit send on that. And that kind of, the light went off, and I have fun with it now.
They have social media classes?
Just for the old guys. Just for the old guys, right, Cap?
There's something. There's also something. Sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, I would fail miserably at that. It's funny is I have this term for social media, which I'm succeeding in spite of myself on social media. But to me, social media is the driving range. You can leave your game over there if you're not careful. You can tinker with social media. You can plant the crumbs of social media. but it's sort of like hate mail in general. You can get caught up in it, and fan mail too, for that matter. Is you get caught up in social media and you lose focus on what it is you do. What we do is we produce shows. We do shows on radio. We do shows on podcasts. I'm not doing a 12-character show. Social media is just the driving range for what we ultimately do, and that's to drive people to our shows.
Tamryn, how do you use it for your podcasting?
I'm sorry.
What's that?
How do you use it for your podcasting, social media?
Just to tease people to the topics, just to tease people to the subject matter, just to plant that seed that here's what the show is going to be about, because we're about long form shows. We're not about 12-character shows.
Okay. Tamryn?
I think it's a great way to build. I mean, as everybody was saying, this is about branding. And I think that letting people know who you are is a big part of that. And kind of as Sarah was saying, engaging on a variety of topics, bringing your audience into different viewpoints. And all of this can feed into the content that you're actually creating. For example, the episode we're working on right now is dropping Friday, and it's about, this very topic. But I think now more than ever, it is super important to that community aspect. Even though it's online, people really do want to hear what certain people think and kind of get a feel for who you are as a person rather than just a static, entity in the machine. So I feel like it's more of that purpose.
And for podcasts, Tamryn, I bet you get guests off of it, because I absolutely get guests for my podcast. I see that some famous person is following me and tweeting me, and I'm like, oh, hey, nice to see you here. Would you like to come on my show? I'm like,
Absolutely.
Oh, you're interested? Let's do this. So it's very useful that way.
Can I ask the
100%.
panel real quickly about social media during your shows? Like, David, how do you guys use social media during shows? I know for me, I would have Twitter on when I was doing radio full time, and I use that to build a conversation. And I know some hosts that don't look at it at all. So just if you guys don't mind chiming in on that, just the technical side of it.
So for me, I'm on it every single second I'm on the air. I respond to people while we're talking. I did that when I did the show myself. I do that now that I have Jonathan Hood as my partner. I just feel like if you're taking the time to bring something worthwhile to the discussion, I will crank out something really quick. Might not get to it till a break, but if I can during the show, yeah, I absolutely engage. And I think it is a great way, A, to build your brand, B, it's free advertising to say, hey, guess what? Coming up on Sarah's show tonight, guess who she's going to talk to? That may strike a chord with someone who goes, I got to make sure 7:30, I got to hear that interview.
Well, and in the middle of the show, I would say Cap is a longtime radio host who can multitask. I have worked with people before, and they get caught up in what people are saying on Twitter, and it takes. And then there's one co-host that I had, and it was like you'd be in the middle of a conversation, and he would get so caught up in what someone said about his opinion that it would just derail straight to this one person with 4 followers. And I'm like, okay, like every once in a while during a show, during breaks especially, I'll scan and see what people were really into, or oh, that's a great point by this person. But for the most part, I think you have to be careful that your focus isn't away from the conversation and the relationship with your co-host, and also that you're not like ego isn't coming into play where someone made you mad and now you're going to derail a show so you can yell at that person instead of like sticking with the topic.
Good point.
I can answer that. Here's an old call-in radio show guy talking about this. So what's happened, if you really want to have active participation of the show, and somebody who's below the age of 40 doesn't know what a radio call-in show even is anymore. I mean, only your dad knows to call a radio show. So you've got a whole generation of people that this is how they expect to interact. This is how they make comments. This is how they're funny or crazy or whatever it is. So the old rule in radio was that you use the call to make the show better. I often tell the audience, make my show better or else go away. I don't need you to tell me I'm great or terrible. Make my show better. And I've found that people are, particularly younger generation, is so much more entertaining and so much more opinionated because of social media. It can be good for the show as long as you stay focused to say your tweet, your comment, or your call is only about making the show better. And I think that there's an entire generation. I don't really know anymore that it's even that necessary to go to the phones anymore. You've got thousands of people on Twitter that are great. They're funny. They're insightful. You just have to know how to use it to make the show better for the 99% of people who aren't commenting to you.
Excellent. Sarah, just a few moments ago, you teed up the next thing I want to move us into. And in specific, I know that there was an article, and I wrote it down in the Athletic the past couple days, maybe 2 days ago.
Yesterday.
That caused a bit of a stir, right?
Yeah.
Why do so few women work in sports radio? And I know that you were actively involved on Twitter talking about that. They say traditional sports radio is an overwhelmingly male audience. Some say as high as 90%. And that can lead to criticisms about its content and whether it's sexist and all of the different angles that come into it. So I guess my question to you would be, is there a right way or a better way or a good way that we should all be approaching this from producing content to make it more inclusive or more respectful?
Yeah, it was funny. That story came out yesterday morning, and it was that thing where people were sending me comments and responses. Oh, can't wait to see what Sarah's going to say about this. Because a lot of the responses from men, including one that was the head of a communications department, was the reason why there's no women is because they don't want the job. Women don't care about sports. Which was this the same excuse we use for why we don't have enough black head coaches in the NFL, even though the league is predominantly black? None of them want to do the job. No, it's about the pipelines you create, and it's about whether they feel included. And I will say, when I wanted to get into sports radio, was the last thing I wanted to do, and it ended up being the first thing I did and the biggest part of my career, and remains a huge part of my career. But growing up, I didn't hear a single woman on radio. When I got to ESPN 1000 to do updates, they hadn't had a woman regularly in 11 years. And I left 5 or 6 years ago, and they haven't had one since. Now, Shea Pepler was on hosting with Dave a bunch, but a regular everyday voice. Now, one thing about radio is there's a really small number of people, right? Something like television or even writing, there's a lot more opportunities for there to be multiple journalists or multiple TV personalities across different shows. But I also think it operates a little bit like baseball until very recently, when I think baseball is starting to realize they got to change something or they're screwed. It was, we have a grasp of this limited range, 15 to 45 or whatever it is of men. And we don't want to scare them away with any women or black people. We really want to hang on to them. So we're just going to keep it the same all the time, because we don't want any of those people to get afraid when they hear a woman's voice or a person of color, or God forbid, an LGBTQ plus person. Instead of saying, we are blowing off 50% plus of our population and not trying to appeal to them at all. What kind of business model is that? It's a terrible business model. And it insults the men that are listening to assume that they can't handle a woman or a person of color or someone who has a different lived experience. We all know across companies the meaning that goes into when you put people in a room that have different experiences and perspectives, how it fixes major problems and issues and keeps you from getting fired for insulting women and sexualizing them, which has happened a bunch in Chicago alone, right? Tons of suspensions and firings because people don't know how to interact with somebody because they've been in their bubble of men for the entirety of their careers. That's behind the scenes, that's at the board, that's producing, it's all dudes. And I get it, it's a scary thing to extend into something, but what you're doing is you're just making your audience smaller and smaller and smaller and not appealing. I mean, look at the NFL. 50% of the NFL fans are women. Why would they not be listening to sports radio about football? Because guess what? For a very long time, and still in some markets, the conversation is women ruin everything. I tried to have a fantasy football league, but my wife showed up. Or like, that's gay. Or any number of insulting, misogynist, racist things. And it's so ephemeral because it's not on your television where you stop, record it. It kind of feels like it goes away, even though we have podcasts now. Oh, they just said it and it goes away. And so we don't hold people to the fire when they say awful things. I mean, there used to be jokes about Ron Santos' diabetes and losing his legs in Chicago. That was a funny thing for some of the sports radio hosts to make. I mean, there's a real cruelty and a real exclusivity there that I think makes it so that people do not feel invited. And I realize I just turned this into my own TED Talk, and I apologize for that. I clearly have a lot of thoughts, but we've been talking about this for decades. There are stories like the one yesterday from 40 years ago, 30 years ago. Why are there no women? There's a million reasons, and everyone ignores them and just goes to, well, they don't want to work here.
You know, you use the phrase bubble of men. So I'm going to put to all of you, if that's the case, how do you burst the bubble of men? How do you do that?
Well, can I just say that you just do it? And I just want to use myself as an example. Everything Sarah said, I embody everything she just said. I have an independent podcast because my voice isn't included in mainstream outlets. Nobody's seeking out my voice. And it's not because, I don't know my stuff. So I just, I feel like it's okay to like use myself as that example, that it's like, I found this missing in the space. I'm going to create it myself and get it done and hope that, of course, wow, it'd be great if some company swooped in and said, hey, we'll run you through our network or something like that. But everything Sarah said is true. Like, I became editor-in-chief at Swish Appeal in 2018, the first woman of a women's basketball site. And I'm not sure how that happens, but it is a pipeline issue. And I feel like a lot of content creators, especially in women's basketball, are doing it on their own because they're like, okay, the technology's here, let's do it ourselves if other people aren't going to make a way for us. And, women are 50% of the planet and do care. And I also think we have to stop insulting the intelligence of men, assuming that they just want to hear, I don't know, whatever kind of bar jokes and nothing else. I think that that's also not helping the space.
Theo Epstein also. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is one of the great, in fact, sort of business killing mistakes terrestrial radio has made. A lot of us in the business could see this coming. All you had to do was ever sit back and study a ratings report, and you would see year after year, guess what would happen? If your demographics are targeting 25, 54, guess what's happening? They're aging out of the demographic. If you build a medium, and this is sort of where radio has thrown the door open for people to jump in and say, you know what, I'll take that. I'll take that audience. I'll take that audience away from you. The longer radio decided to become and only be about old white guys talking to old white guys, well, guess what happens? The old white guys die off and you become seers. And it's the very thing that for many of us that have worked in the industry, we can see coming. It's very frustrating because you want to grow the audience, you want to grow the brand, you want to tap into an entire generation of people that want to join the medium, yet you've talked your way out of it. And by talking your way out of it, you've restricted your audience down dramatically. It's almost non-existent in many cases. And you've also cut yourself off to the great opportunities that are out there. It's the one thing in the radio business that dinosaur executives have not been able to pivot to. And so they've thrown the door open for talented people to say, you know what, radio, you go ahead and stay there. You stay in that space. I'll take that audience. And that's exactly what has happened. And that's a healthy thing.
Mm-hmm.
Cap, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to. Sarah mentioned someone that I worked with, Shay Pepler. Shay was amazing, and I wish she would have stayed because I would love to be doing a show 5 days a week with Shay Pepler. Unfortunately, she had to relocate because of her husband, Jordan, moving to Bristol. But Theo Epstein said to me one day, he had made a great comment. We got into this long discussion. He said, why do I only hire people that look like me, are educated like me, sound like me, and think like me? He said, that's my fault. We have to be better at going, well, that person looks different than me, thinks different, but maybe that perspective would make my radio show so much better than just finding another guy who laughs at the same movie lines and the same dumb jokes. And it's a perspective, I think, that can carry you just not in sports radio, everywhere. Be willing to think outside the box. Be willing to go, you know what? That might be really good for your show, and you would never think about it before.
I think decision makers, as everyone has pointed out, right? Who are the decision makers in sports radio? I can talk about my local market. It's a lot of old white males. Shout out to the old white males. Like, you guys are awesome and you give opportunities for a lot of people. But unfortunately, in sports radio, those opportunities are shut, and it's not fair at times, right? And I'll give you two examples real quickly. I was up for a pretty high profile job within the market. And when I first met with one of the decision makers, the first thing he said was, how am I going to explain to my audience that a Raheel Ramzanali is replacing a longtime host, right? And I go, you don't have to explain anything. I'm just as talented, people like me, whatever it is. You don't have to explain that, right? And then I was doing a show with a black guy, and we had a #1 show, and we lost that show because the old white guy liked to listen to another white guy. And he's like, hey, we're just pulling the show because we want to give this guy an opportunity. When we're like, hey, we just had a #1 show, you're just taking it away. So as long as the decision makers look a certain way and are, behaving a certain way because that's all they know, then the change will never come. Like in the Houston market, there's 3 sports radio stations. There are no females full-time. They're not even part-time. They're nothing. There's only 2 black guys full-time, 1 black producer, and I was the other person of color until I lost my job. So it's a model that can't support growth. There are other people, and as I said in the snippet, and I'm sorry, I'm turning this into my TED talk real quickly, but as I said in my snippet on social media here, you look around and when you go to sporting events, it's not just white males watching sports anymore, right? And the numbers, obviously, if you
Forever was. Although
yeah,
they might have been the only ones who could afford the cost of attendance, that doesn't mean the only ones that they're paying attention. Yeah,
and that's a great point too. It's like everyone cares about sports, right? Why are certain people only getting a seat at the table? And it's great with podcasts, and that's why I love podcasts. And Tamryn, you're a great example of this. I'm gonna bring my own chair to this table, and I don't care, old white guy. You're not taking this from me. I'm gonna bring it here, and I'm gonna bring my own audience and my own community until you can't ignore me. So I love that. But unfortunately, when it comes to just sports radio, we're stuck until the decision makers change.
Well, and I want to say quickly, there's that saying, scared money don't make money. So I get it. It's scary to look at a model that has ostensibly worked, especially if you've been a program director for years and you have continued to shuttle through middle-aged white dudes. And it's been like, I'm fine. Everything's fine. Well, maybe things could be great and big and huge, but you're so scared of change that you won't try it. And so then you're just repeating the same thing. And to Jeff's point, the Sears or baseball, people are dying out and they're finding that, and to Dave's point, hosting Spain and Company, which you had your own version of that, and you've got a bunch of hosts coming in, you realize the different shows and how they become different because of who you're hosting with. And I make my Caddyshack joke, and Jason Goff, my black host, says, "Yeah, we're not into that movie. That's not our thing. Like, I'm gonna make a joke about this," and then the audience that isn't into Caddyshack is gonna get to laugh at that joke instead of you making white be the norm. Everybody's gonna have this same life experience to laugh at and to pull experiences from, instead of saying, how many more people can you bring in that will make somebody else who's new to the model and the medium say, now I want in because I've been invited because someone looks like me or talks like me or has a background like me.
It's also odd, real quickly, when you have sports radio hosts and decision makers who eventually go from sports radio host to a programming director and maybe VP, whatever it may be. Like, we as sports radio hosts will criticize teams and coaches for not changing and evolving with the game, right? And then here we are making the same mistakes of not looking at what other brands are doing. And I said this when I left ESPN Houston. I'm like, why is it that a global brand used me for a global campaign, and then another global company is using me for stuff, and then you guys can't use me and elevate me in certain positions, right? Like, you guys are missing out. There's obvious, at the end of the day, it's about money, right? There's obvious that there's money in diversity. So why are you not paying attention and not evolving with what other companies are doing? Why is it that sports radio is so stuck in its ways?
Yeah, I'll pull the curtain back even further and be even more politically incorrect as it pertains to radio management. First of all, the concept of a program director should be obsolete. What's the point? I hire a host, I turn them loose, you build a brand, you make a show, it doesn't work, go away. I mean, the model is so antiquated that it's almost completely lost. What I'm saying is the standard, not every radio station by any stretch, but the industry as a whole, particularly sports radio, and maybe even worse, and I do both, talk radio is even dumber and older. And it's really walked itself into an impossible place. And any one of us that has been in the business very long, you can just take a look. 5 years ago, you were an 8 share. 3 years ago, you're a 6 share. You're still the same great host, and guess what's happening? The building of the brand itself, the model of the industry, is not tapping into any new audiences. It is the equivalent, and I got in trouble for saying this one time in a meeting. We are becoming Sears. Guess what happened to Sears? They didn't adapt and didn't pivot. But the good thing now is, as everybody on this panel can attest, it's created this giant vacuum for this sort of gold rush of content. So that is different, talented, interesting, compelling. All that stuff is now working. All that stuff is now working well. In radio, traditional radio, standing on the sidelines looking out going, why can't I have that? You can't have it anymore because you refuse to acknowledge it and pivot. You didn't take the risk. And since you didn't take the risk, you're now down to a 2 and 4 share and you're going to lose.
You know, you all bring up excellent points. You're obviously all passionate about this topic. You all have opened a lot of eyes with your comments and made some suggestions and brought up some ideas that I think have great value. And I guess my question is, with all this awareness, with all of the discussion that we've seen, not only just right here, but in the past 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it's been, there's a time when you got to stop talking the talk and start walking the walk. So with everything that you said, like, I'm going to start with you, Sarah. Are you optimistic that it's having an impact and change is in the offing?
I'm optimistic that it's a little better, right? Shanae Ogumake joined our lineup, so we have a full-time, for the first time, Black female voice weekdays on ESPN radio, along with me. So now we have 2 women that you can hear every day. It used to be 0 forever, but I don't know about local radio. In fact, when I was at ESPN 1000, I don't mean to dog them because they gave me a start and I enjoyed my time there, but I remember there was a couple times where a host called in sick or was running late, and they would freak out and they would try to find somebody last minute. And I would be sitting in the building and I had a national ESPN radio show on the weekend. Now I was green, right? But I was hosting national radio on the weekends, and they would freak out and try to find someone from another building or a different outlet to come in and host. And I would be like, I'm right here. Like, I'm right here. And it was first of all wild that they would freak out so much about someone who'd been on the air for years having to be by themselves for a half hour. That was eye-opening. But also beyond that, I just didn't think it occurred to them. And so when I hear local radio stuff, and that's where the stories most often come out about over-the-top ridiculous things that have been said about women in the industry, people with disabilities, people of color, LGBT. I mean, that is still the last bastion of the old boys club where we're going to get away with whatever we want. And I don't have as much hope, but I do feel like there's at least a push for it. And the old gatekeepers are getting the doors beat down a lot more than they used to change things. And that's what social media can do. It gives the voice to all these people saying, we're not going to keep giving you money and time unless you start to actually adjust to the things that we're demanding. So a lot of hope nationally. We'll see locally.
You local folks agree?
By the way, I just lost an earring. I was so passionate. It was like I was about to fight somebody. Like, let me take these hoops off first.
I actually am more encouraged, and I understand where Sarah's coming from. She's right. I mean, Eric, you're in Chicago, and there have been certain people that have been fired 5 times, but because they could bring Budweiser in for $50,000, done. Hire him. And, you know, I'll give you an example. Craig Carton just got out of jail, and they're beating his door down to hire him back. And he's incredibly talented. He is very, very fun to listen to. He's literally like 3 months out of jail, and he's got 5 different stations all coming with big money contracts going, well, you get advertisers and you're entertaining, so we'll bring you back. And that's unfortunate. I think we've turned the corner. I do. I think we're getting better. My station now is not owned by ESPN. It's owned by Good Karma Brands. That is a huge, huge part of their initiative. They want women on the air. They want people of color on the air. And I hope that we're headed in the right direction.
Let's transition into talking about how you relate to your audience and the type of content that you feel compelled to give them. As a host, what responsibilities do you feel like you have to your audience? And by that, I mean, do you feel more compelled to spend time giving them what they want or giving them your own perspectives? Or do the two ever collide with one another where you realize there's something I want to talk about here, there's an angle I want to take, but it may not be the best for what the audience needs? Raheel, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think the best advice I have with that is be yourself, okay? And that's what I try to be is, look, I'm going to give you who I am on radio, on any kind of videos that I do, on social media. It's going to be me, and I'm going to give you hopefully a unique perspective, and that's what you like about me, and that's what you're going to keep coming back for. That's all I can offer, because I don't try to keep an on-air personality versus social media or anything like that. I try to make it as easy as possible. That's who I am. Here's what you're going to get. You're going to get in various forms. And like, I get stressed out thinking about people that, try to do something on air, and that's just my on-air personality. And then when they sign off, it's like I'm a totally different person. That stresses me out. So I think just be you across all platforms.
Tamryn, I saw you raise your hand, and I actually do want to ask you, when you're putting together your podcast, or you're coming up with a topic for it, or a content, or the direction you want to take it, is it more what you feel that you want to talk about, or is it more, or does it ever enter into your mind, here's something the audience might want to hear about?
It's definitely what the audience might want to hear about. Usually it's pinned to something that is newsworthy that, I feel isn't receiving enough coverage. And of course, news happens, and you look at major outlets like ESPN. So every time something happens, they've got to keep the stories going. And sometimes things just don't get the attention I feel they need. For example, the WNBA players working with the Say Her Name campaign all season, trying to get justice for Breonna Taylor. And there was a lot of work inside and outside the bubble towards that end. And I just wanted to go deeper into what the organization is doing, how the WNBA players are working with that organization, and just to kind of bring that in-depth coverage of it. So it's very much, I'm not sure if it's what people want to know, but it's definitely what people, I feel, need to know, or is needed in the space to offer more complete understanding of certain issues that, during a game at halftime, Holly Rowe can ask a question. There's only so much time for her and a player or a coach to get into what's happening, to talk about Say Her Name or whatever. So there are other ways to do that. And I very rarely use it as a platform to talk about myself. The first time I did an episode about myself of any part was the most recent one, which is talking about what the players have done to support voter registration and everything heading up to the election, and talking about voter suppression and the weird stuff that's happening with our mail. And I recently moved, and so I just started the episode because authenticity, I think, matters. And it's like, well, this is affecting me. I haven't received mail in 2 months since I moved. No mail forwards are going, and so I can't cast my mail-in ballot, and so I had to speed up the process of establishing residency in my new state, and so that I can vote here, which I did get that ballot. So that, I just kind of use that as a tie-in to the bigger story. But I feel that's important. It was relevant, and it, is just an example of something that happened that people may not know is going on.
Yeah, I want to say something. I think this is a really important discussion that doesn't have a really precise answer. And I don't think it has to have a precise answer, and that is what your audience expects of you. If you're more news-oriented, be clear with your audience on more news-oriented. What I think is the operative words here would be you're intellectually honest. So one of the things that I think we lose sight of is the audience, the medium is successful. We're all successful because it's raw. It is exactly what we want to bring to the table. It is not scripted. It is not formatted. It is not programmed, and they like it that way. And that's what we do. But we do have an obligation to be intellectually honest. If I think this, I need to own it. I need to back it up. I need to respect it. You may not see it that way. At the same time, I think one of the big problems over time in sort of the talk format has been pretending that we're the news. We're not the news. In fact, I'll bet you once a month I tell the audience, you know what? If you need to get some news, you need to get the news. I'm a bar stool to share our thoughts and opinions about the news. I'm going to tell you what I think. You're going to tell me what you think, but do not pretend for a second that I'm replacing your local newspaper or your local radio station for news. That's on you. And I think we have an obligation, and I think to a large part we've blurred the lines to an unhealthy part, and that is pretending I'm going to tell you the way it is. I'm going to tell you what the news is. And I think that's intellectually dishonest and irresponsible. It happens a lot.
Well, I find you all to be incredibly inspiring. Yes, Sarah?
I was just going to say really quick, I think there is that balance to Jeff's point of whatever your show is and who you are. especially with national, we got to play some of the hits is what we call it. You know, if there's a big story nationally, we're going to hit that, but how we talk about it is going to be authentic to us and what we find interesting about it. And if we're going to do that, playing the hit story about, you know, Ryan Fitzpatrick being emotional about losing his job to Tua and what this means for the Dolphins and the next step, maybe the next segment is going to be something about Renee Montgomery and the WNBA, or because I care about it. I remember I had to fight to talk about Serena Williams almost dying in childbirth, and an old producer said no one cares about that, and I said, this is one of the greatest athletes of all time, and it is a compelling story. Well, not that it's tennis. It doesn't even have to do it. It doesn't matter if it's tennis. It's an incredible story. It's not even about women. It's literally one of the most famous athletes of our time almost died. Oh my God, let's talk about it, right? And so it's getting out of that idea of like, I'm not used to that. So let's get back to tonight is Monday Night Football, especially if it's not authentic to me. And then the listeners are going to say, I love that I got to hear something different because every show was the same thing. So I try to push back on that idea of if you're watching ESPN all day or listening all day and everyone talks about the same exact stuff, why wouldn't it be more interesting for me to bring something I find compelling and explain to you why you should care about it too?
A great point, because I come in every morning and it's, okay, what are we talking about with the Bears? And I'm like, guys, we don't even play till Monday. Do we have to keep going over Nick Foles and our offensive line? Can we talk about something else?
You all are, I was going to say, your passion is obvious. I find it inspirational as a fellow broadcaster. I'm not in sports radio, but I consume it daily in massive amounts, and I text Cap nonstop during his show and aggravate the hell out of him. And I admire all the work that you do, and I know that there are many people that feel the same way, that have been watching this, that I hope have been inspired by what you've said. I hope they've been motivated to do special things in this medium, because it is a vibrant medium. It is important. There's a lot of opportunity. And I think Jeff brought it up, that if you have a passion and you do something well and you commit to it and you strive to be the best that you can possibly be, there's always a place for someone who has that kind of commitment to doing a great job. There's always going to be a place in this medium and in all of communications for those people. And you folks embody that very essence. So thank you for being a part of this. I know that Professor Butterworth has been monitoring and that there are questions. We've hit that 3:15 mark, and I know that he was going to come back on and join us and share some of the audience questions that they had with you guys. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. It really, truly was eye-opening and inspirational.
Thanks so much, Eric. As you suggested, we do have a number of questions. Before we get to them, I want to echo what Eric just said about just how much energy and intellectual, well, I don't want to use the word energy again, but how much intellectual energy there was in that conversation. I can't thank you all enough. Real quickly, I have to answer Eric's question during the middle of the conversation. Yes, we here at the University of Texas at Austin have a social media and sports class, and it's part of the sports media minor that we sponsor in the Center for Sports Communication and Media.
Take that.
The
Can you get my son in there?
Public Relations. So yes, it's definitely a thing. All right, so several questions, and if we can't get to the question that you raised, I apologize in advance, but we'll try to get through them. I'm going to start with a question for Tamryn, because this question was in response to comments you were making about the degree to which the field has become so saturated. So the question for you from Barrett, who's a student at Ferris State in Michigan, so thanks, Barrett, is how do you balance staying within your own comfort zone and then also maybe trying to reach across to other niche sports that can help you grow your audience when you know that you're facing so much saturation?
Wow, that's a great question. I would just start by saying none of this is my comfort zone. I'm a writer, like that's if we lived in the 50s and I could be like J.D. Salinger and just live in the backwoods of nowhere and just send paper manuscripts to an editor and have it published and they send me money, like I would be ecstatic. But that's not what the landscape allows. So this is me being out of my comfort zone. And I feel like the WNBA and women's basketball still just gets such marginal coverage overall. I think it's like 4% of all sports. So I don't see myself branching off into any other sport. Basketball is what I love, and women's hoops especially. So I'm sticking there because that's my passion.
So that certainly allows you to play to your strengths for sure. Ariana has asked a question that is directed to Raheel, talking about, this was in the conversation about balancing with social media. And Ariana wants to know, how do you approach your job when you know you're competing both with other journalists, but then also competing with kind of the avalanche of content that shows up in social media?
You have to get creative. You have to get unique. Try to find a different perspective, and if you have that perspective, amplify it as much as possible. Reach out to guests that are bigger than you. Try to leverage their network as well. Do anything and everything possible to stand out, because everyone is creating content, not just in the sports world anymore. It's everywhere, right? So do everything in your power. Try to figure out how you can stand out, and there's so many different ways. So if you'd like to talk a little bit more about it, please feel free to tweet me, and we can continue the conversation there. And I can lay out a plan that's a little bit more detailed.
That's the beauty of social media right there,
Yeah.
being able to incorporate it. Let me direct this next question to Jeff. This comes from Ken Capps, who's a graduate of the J School here at the University of Texas at Austin. And Ken wants to know about a recent report from Dallas about sort of ending the relationship with ESPN radio in Dallas. And actually, David, you mentioned no longer being owned by ESPN in Chicago as well. Thinking about these big markets and the way that we might see the changes in ownership structure, you commented on some of the ownership issues and general management issues. Why is that happening in a big market like Dallas-Fort Worth, would you suspect?
Well, I mean, there's quite a few things. Not even to dismiss COVID and what it's done to the advertising market. Okay, I mean, we are a function of two things. We're a function of ad revenue, or a function of subscriptions. Which one are you? And so it's a daily healthy battle. Which one of those things should I be? And I think media companies are trying to invent themselves to decide, should we go a subscription route or should we be an advertising route? And I think they're struggling to find out exactly what they are and where their space is and what's healthy. I got this theory that I think that our industry that we knew to the typical radio industry of 20 years ago, like every sort of disruption, because not to nerd out on business again, but disruption is healthy. And this is a full-on podcasting disruption that has blown up the traditional media world in a very, very healthy way. It's not much fun when we go through it, but the other side of this is going to be smarter, smaller media companies. It's going to be smarter, smaller talk show hosts who may be subscription-based. It's going to be smaller and smarter podcasting stations. And I think they'll all circle back. I think the giant companies of old have learned we better blow ourselves up, and we're going to come back and reinvent ourselves without programming directors, without VPs, and we're going to have a boss, and we're going to have a bunch of talk show hosts, and we're going to own that platform of podcasts. We're not going to have the heavy layers. We're not going to have all that stuff that we used to have. So I think the business as a model itself, to answer his question, I think ESPN is probably going through this. I worked for a company for 20 years that was one of that started the first sports radio station in New York. Genius people, but over time, I think they realized our model has got to be blown up, and I think they're going to circle back. The ESPNs of the world, the MSs of the world, these big media companies are going to come back and say, well, all these people are on this panel, I need to hire you. I just don't need to have a bunch of bosses.
Yeah, let's stay with the business side for just a moment, because Cap, this next question was in response to your comments about the tendency for stations to want to hire people who can bring in the advertisers. Can you give us a little more insight about how much that capacity to bring in advertisers and sponsorship plays a role in the hiring process?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a young broadcaster, you're probably not going to have great ties in the advertising community. I don't want to put a blanket statement over it, but I've been doing this a very, very long time, almost 22 years at WGN, where I developed a relationship with Chevrolet and another one with an electronics retailer. And when I left to go to ESPN, I called the 5 or 6 companies that I was endorsing at WGN and said, hey, I'm leaving. I'm going to a different station. Can I get you to come with me? And every single one of them did. Now, they didn't ask me for advertisers before they hired me, but I'd been in it a long time. but I think that certainly helps my standing there, that I bring in, significant amounts of revenue. And I do think that if someone has that capacity, that they could say, hey, you know what? Sarah Spain has been endorsing X product, and if we hire her away, that person's going to follow. Yeah, that's just a home run for Sarah then, on both ends. They want her for her talent. And oh, by the way, she's also amazing in that area, so we'll bring her in. Eric, same thing. He's on the #1 show in the morning. There's nobody better in Chicago than that guy. And people want to advertise with him. And that, to say that it doesn't play a role, that there may not be a more talented person right over there, but he's also walking in the door with however many thousands of dollars in advertising, it absolutely plays a role.
Yeah, if I could add to the business part, again, my other nerdy side, but I think all we're seeing right now, I think we're making more of it than it really is from a corporate standpoint. These companies, these media companies that we all grew up with, are a lot like record companies. They're just not very efficient models right now, but they're being forced to reinvent themselves as more efficient models. And that doesn't mean the talent that you're here today is going away. In fact, it will be more valuable than ever before, because just like a quarterback is more valuable than the offensive coordinator, they're going to reinvent themselves to realize we can no longer be large and top heavy, because the podcasting world has forced us to change. So it's really just kind of a disruption of efficiencies that I do think will circle back, but they'll just be smaller, better run companies.
So there clearly are a lot of things that will have to keep monitoring in that respect. One of the things that comes up in these kinds of discussions quite a bit, especially we have a lot of students, both at the University of Texas at Austin and elsewhere, who are listening in and watching today. And those students want to know, how can they be in the position that you're in? Sarah, I'm going to ask you to respond to this question. And this is from an anonymous participant who specifically wants to be the next Stephen A. Smith. But we can think about that as how do we translate a career in this industry to a kind of national stage? What's your best advice in that respect?
Okay, first of all, the unmitigated gall of being, no, I'm just kidding, of being the next Stephen A. It's tough because, like I said, I didn't want to get into radio. And so I just happened to get lucky with a couple opportunities based on people who had seen me do some stuff. And so had me come on. And then there was an opportunity through WGN, which Dave worked at, through my writing, where they were looking for a radio show that was going to kind of be tied to some of the blog stuff the Tribune was doing. So that's how I got my in. And then ESPN 1000 heard me and pulled me over. So it was this very slow, gradual thing. But I think you have to stay open to the opportunities across the mediums, because sometimes when you get into them, you'll actually find that what you thought you really liked about TV, you actually prefer radio. Radio is extemporaneous and long and community-based, and you have plenty of time to talk through things and go on tangents and talk about things a little bit outside of sports. TV is much more regimented, and if it's 22 minutes and you're trying to, especially around the horn, we're literally timed and muted if we don't get our thoughts out fast enough. And then writing is solitary and lonely, but when you're done, you look and you say, oh, that's exactly the product I wanted at the end, because you edited over and over till you got. They're all very different, and you won't know which one you like until you're actually putting into practice. So I would say stay very versatile. Take as many courses as you can across all of those mediums so that you're aware and ready to get your foot in the door no matter what the opportunity is, even if it's not the one you ultimately want. Start with that foot in the door as a writer and then work your way up. Or like to what Raheel said earlier, you may think you want to do radio, but at some point you're going to be so good at radio, they're going to put you on TV to talk about something, and you're going to have to figure out whether you can do that too. One thing I would also say, and it's great to want to be the next whatever, but you're just going to be a B-rate version copy of that person. Make sure you are really digging deep to figure out what it is about you that makes you special and why people would want to follow you. Mine has always been my sarcasm, my sense of humor. It's what I led with when I was green and didn't really know what I was doing. I did funny videos with Chicago athletes, which is really what got people to notice me, more so than trying to be the really serious person. I'm not going to break news at 22 with no connections, but I am going to make the athlete feel comfortable talking to me, do some funny bits, use my Second City improv, bring that into play, and then they're going to like me, and people are going to want to see those videos because they get to know the athletes better. So really find the thing that you're great at and lean into that instead of saying, I need to be the next, or trying to copy something you already see. Create a space for what doesn't exist yet.
Be you, right, Sarah?
From your fellow panelists on that response. And as we get close to having to wrap up here, we have just a couple minutes left. let me open it up to the whole panel to respond both to that question. And then finally, Kahari, who is a student at Emerson College in Boston, is curious to know if you think that podcasting will take over as the dominant form of sports media. And so I'll let you all quickly reflect on those ideas as we wrap up.
Well, I just want to follow up what Sarah said. Be you. That's what our football coach here in Chicago likes to say. But you can't come in and go, I want to be Stephen A. and start screaming. You got to be you. Sarah talked about what she brings to the table. I think I bring my passion to the table. Passion isn't yelling louder. It is, you can tell when someone's passionate about the topic that they're talking about. In terms of podcasting, maybe, but I still think there's always going to be a role, especially for sports, because you don't want to go back and watch a game that you DVR'd. You want live interaction. You want to know what Sarah thinks about what happened in that football game, or what I think about what the Bears did on Thursday Night Football. I still think that'll always have a role.
Yeah, I think podcasts and radio are going to go hand in hand. They already are hand in hand. You look at some of the numbers behind it. Podcast numbers for a radio show are really good, and podcasts have their own numbers. And there's so much going on. I think it's more looking at them hand in hand. Don't think about them as competition anymore. That's just not what it is, because every station podcast shows, and every show wants to do a podcast, right? So it's all about that synergy there.
I think they're interconnected, but to Dave's point, I do think, especially if you've just watched a game and the Cubs get a big win, you want to turn on your radio and hear what they're saying in that moment. It's the same way that, you don't want locker rooms to open an hour after the game ends. You want to get the players right after they've played because they're still bringing all that energy. We want to do that with the games we just heard. And even though I think callers aren't quite as necessary as they used to be because of social media, there is still that element of being on and part of a show that is happening with a live radio show more so than a podcast. So I think it's very hand in hand, and there are going to be times when you want one or the other. But I think it'd be tough to see it going away in that live reaction that people want.
Well, I cannot thank you all enough. That is a spectacular conversation that I wish we could have in more length. And we apologize for those of you who did ask questions that we weren't able to get to. I encourage you to go ahead and post them to social media and hit us up there, and we'll try to get those questions answered. So I want to say sincerely thank you to Tamryn Spruill, David Kaplan, Raheel Ramzanali, Sarah Spain, Jeff Ward, our moderator, Eric Ferguson, at home, our program manager, Chris Hart for the Center for Sports Communication and Media. On behalf of everybody here, thanks for making the McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society a success. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you
for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.